Play Nirvana.
The Cobain 50.
Nirvana.
Kurt Cobain's top 50 albums.
Nirvana.
From listener-powered KEXP.
This is the Cobain 50 from listener-powered KEXP. I'm Dusty Henry.
And I'm Martin Douglas. And this week, Dusty and I will both be tackling the canonical split album from The Faith and Void, conveniently titled Faith Void Split, which was released in 1982.
I think this is our first and only split release on the list. Is that right?
Yeah, it is. You and I have had a split episode when we tackled Wipers, but this is the first album from two different bands. And yeah, the only album from two different bands on this list.
I'm really glad that there was a split release included because there's like something so quintessentially punk about a split release.
Oh yeah, we'll definitely get into that after our piece on The Faith and Void, Faith Void Split on the Cobain 50.
Welcome, good members of the Cobain 50 congregation. Come with me as we take one last trip to the fertile, sacred, hardcore ground of our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. With great joy and an open heart, I present to you The Faith. Yes, DC has come up again and again on this series, and for good reason. As a true devotee to hardcore, it makes sense that Kurt would have so much affection for the DC scene. But in the very early 80s, just as the scene was in its infancy, no longer in utero, it seemed like it all might actually be coming to an end. Some of the biggest names in the scene were starting to fade away. There were groups like Red Sea, who made a splash when they emerged in 1981, but broke up after only 6 or 7 shows. There was also SOA, who received great praise for their fast, ferocious breed of hardcore before singer Henry Rollins left the band to front Black Flag instead. And who could forget the Untouchables? One of the earliest bands in DC's hardcore scene, starting in 1979, before breaking up in 1981. And you can't talk about DC without talking about Minor Threat, the preeminent band of DC punk. The Untouchables might have been gone, but at least Minor Threat was still Oh, wait. They took a brief hiatus in 1982 after their second 7-inch and before their classic album, Out of Step. For the scene to survive, there would need to be some new blood. And not just the kind from the mosh pits. And as we've noted a few times in this series, when one punk band breaks up, another always emerges from the ashes. That's why almost every hardcore band is a supergroup in some way. The Faith represents this idea perfectly. The group formed in 1981 with vocalist Alec Mackay of the Untouchables. Also, he was the younger brother of Ian Mackay of Minor Threat and Discord Records fame, among many more bands. And, fun fact, you know the bald guy on the cover of Minor Threat's self-titled record? The guy with his head down? That's actually Alec. Anyway. SOA's Michael Hampton and Ivar Hansen joined on guitar and drums respectively. And then there was Chris Bald from, well, Nothing Yet. This was actually his first band. But he'd go on to be a major player in the DC scene too. A key aspect of the Faith was just how young they were. When they formed, all of the members were between 16 and 17 years old. When they started, they practiced in Hampton's parents' dining room and whatever basement would house the raucous teens. And appropriately, they had their first show at H.B. Woodlawn High School. Alec Mackay recalled to Washington City Papers in 2011, they named their band The Faith because they felt it was a stronger than macho name. And they wanted, quote, something more upful and less nihilistic, in spite of our chaotic and sometimes destructive approach to performance. The band wasted no time getting started, recording their first demo in December of 1981. Their live shows quickly drew a buzz and became a favorite in the scene. With some of their hardcore heroes either broken up or on sabbatical, the Faith filled, well, the void.
Hey man, wait a minute. That was supposed to be my line.
Oh, shit. I'm sorry, dude.
Man, this dude is over here stealing my lines.
Sorry, man. We'll get to the voids in 1 second. Hang in there.
The Faith grew a loyal fan base in DC and beyond. They even earned an avowed fan in Sonic Youth's Thurston Moore. Moore reflected on the band in an interview on Discord's website. He said, quote, I thought of them as the most potent distillation of what DC straight-edge hardcore 1980 was all about in a way, because they were the youngest. It seemed like that really refined minimalism was honed in a way that was really natural. They weren't trying to do anything different from the uniform of the sound that the bands had all sort of agreed on in a way. Because of their age, the Faith couldn't perform much outside of DC, school nights being a minor threat to their success.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
They did play a couple of nights at New York's famed CBGB and supported Bad Brains. Alec Mackay recalled that there was hardly any breathing room, and when they went outside for fresh air, they kept a low profile. In 1982, the Faith made their official recorded debut, Side A to their split record with fellow hardcore band, Void. The split was released by Discord, selling out its first pressing within 2 weeks. The Faith side is a blistering wallop of hardcore. The longest song, In the Black, clocks in at 2 minutes, with the rest of the songs being around a minute or shorter. Before you can even wrap your head around one song, they've already moved on to the next. Alec Mackay's voice pierces through the recordings, every bit as loud and powerful as the shredding guitars, bass, and drums in the mix. They were every bit as hardcore as their hardcore peers and heroes. The record notably included the song You're Exed, their tribute to the straight edge movement. In an interview with DC hardcore zine Thrill Seeker in 1983, the band addressed criticism that the song was enforcing straight edge ethics on their audience. Straight edge being the movement in DC that encouraged abstinence from alcohol and drugs, and instead promoted an overall clean lifestyle. But the band reiterated that it wasn't about telling everyone to be straight edge, but rather calling out hypocrisy from punks who claimed straight edge but didn't abide by it. The band goes on to say they'd seen certain straight edge people drinking and smoking pot just to get with cool people. Hampton ends the dialogue saying, "It's something that's serious to us. You have to make a point, take a stand. Which is which? If these people aren't taking it seriously, fuck them." In an interview with Error Vision in 2011, Alec Mackay recalled the decision from his brother Ian to make this album a split. It was especially surprising since he says that the bands are hardly comparable. Quote, "It's like comparing red versus blue. The two things have their particular jobs to do. They are never close enough to compare, only to contrast and to complement. And that's the whole idea. I suppose it could be interesting to attempt to verbalize the ways that blue is different from red." Even as a split record, the album cemented the Faith as a major part of the DC scene. They'd even bring in Eddie Janney as a second guitarist to continue to build their sound. But like their founding fathers before them, the Faith wasn't going to last. Tensions mounted, and the young members began to think about college. And with that, DC lost the Faith. The band played their last show at the Wilson Center on March 6, 1983. The show was packed. And even though the band was ending, it felt like a culminating moment. Even though the band had become untenable, the band saw the fruits of their hardcore labor. On Discord's webpage for The Faith, the label credits the band for helping launch the scene. Quote, "While Minor Threat is often held up as the preeminent DC band of the early years, for many of the people living here, it was the Faith that they felt the strongest connection to, and it was a sad day when they played their last show." But even in their breakup, the Faith weren't quite done. They'd actually finished recording a new EP titled Subject to Change, which saw an official release a few months after the band had ended.
You know what I stand? I've told you all before. I've had my fair say. You won't hear anymore. I spoke with concern. Won't let me get through. And then you're offended. That I got better things to do.
The new EP showcased the band broadening their sound. While they retained their fury, they were becoming more melodic, a characteristic that would have a lasting impact on DC hardcore. But maybe Alec Mackay put it best. Reflecting on the band's demise with Washington City Papers, he said, "Think of all the bands that came out of the Faith. So I'd say the ending was also a beginning." And he's right. Just as the Faith were born from other broken up bands, they went on to make even more bands. Something we've seen over and over in this podcast. In fact, you could call them something of emo forefathers. As we heard a few episodes ago, Janney went on to join Rites of Spring.
I woke up this morning with a piece of glass caught in my throat. And then I choked.
Hampton and Hanson joined Ian Mackay in Embrace, the other first emo band. And Alec Mackay fronted the post-hardcore band, The Warmers, in the 90s. Music scenes are more than just the couple of big bands you know. As a longtime Seattle resident, that's something I know well. Musical movements are made up of so many groups, musicians, bookers, promoters, showgoers, that all make up the ecosystem. Spending so much time dissecting DC's scene throughout this series is a reminder of all the passing moments and all the bands that create these foundational scenes. For every Minor Threat, Bad Brains, or Fugazi, there are dozens more bands where they came from, and dozens more that they created in some sort of abrasive karmic cycle. The Faith's lifetime was brief. But like real Faith, you could say that their influence was everlasting. Now, it's time to flip the proverbial record over to side B. Martin, take us into the void.
It's interesting that the four-piece Void was so respected that they ultimately found a home in the extremely cloistered DC scene. You might think that the DC scene is more or less an island compared to other East Coast punk communities, not to mention an hour's drive away from Void's hometown, Columbia, Maryland. But in actuality, the region of DC, Maryland, and Virginia, which is commonly referred to nowadays as the DMV, contains parts so close in proximity and culture that they are sometimes jokingly referred to as one state. I mentioned earlier in this series about how the founder of Beat Happening and K Records, Calvin Johnson, attended DC punk shows in spite of living in Chevy Chase, Maryland during his junior year of high school. After all, high school is a time in most of our lives when we become curious about our capabilities and limitations. A lot of us start to think about what is possible for ourselves. For those of us who are enthralled by music, we try making music. The members of Void were all in high school when they first formed the band in 1979. Which is a common theme between both bands on this split album. They didn't all go to the same school, though. Guitarist John Bubba Dupree attended Oakland Mills High School in Columbia, a public school, while the other three, singer John Weifenbach, bassist Chris Stover, and drummer Sean Finnegan, went to Loyola High School in Baltimore, an all-boys private Catholic school. In a 2011 interview with the Washington City paper, Dupree says Columbia was, quote, mostly populated by rednecks and idealistic ex-hippies. For the most part, it was a racially diverse place, but it was a planned community, a suburb. Stover goes on to say that there wasn't much to do in Columbia, so many of the teenagers there would go down to D.C. That's where these four Columbia kids met each other, as well as punk scene stalwarts like Henry Rollins and Ian MacKaye. In 1979, MacKaye was in a band that was partly responsible for kickstarting the DC scene, the Teen Idols. Like a few first-wave punk bands, the youngsters in Void listened to heavy metal and derived their name from the Black Sabbath song, Into the Void. After their formation, a good deal of practice, and shows in various outposts in Maryland, Void played their first DC show in 1980 in the basement of a Presbyterian church known by the punks as the Wilson Center. Organized mostly by members of Bad Brains and described by the Discord Records website as a marathon affair, a staggering 15 bands were on the bill for the show. With that many bands, it's difficult to stand out, but Void's live set was impressive, mostly because of the sheer intensity of their sound and the fact that the band played their songs as fast as humanly possible. Chaos was the order of the day when it came to Void's performances, and the DC punks relished in it. In 1981, Void recorded a demo with Don Zientara at Inner Ear Studios in Arlington, Virginia, where bands like Minor Threat and Bad Brains laid down tracks. On our episode about Bad Brains, I mentioned the band recording their demo tape at Inner Ear, which became something of an underground legend and was later released as the album Black Dots. If you feel inclined, check that out in our archives.
Demonized by the city. Americanized by the pit. Demonized by the city.
It wasn't too long after Void cut their demos when they were approached by Ian MacKaye to join Discord Records. Void recorded 3 songs for the Discord compilation Flex Your Head, which is now regarded as an essential document in the history of hardcore punk. After touring throughout the Northeast for the majority of 1982, Void returned to Inner Ear to record their half of Faith Void Split. In the Washington City Paper interview, Stover mentioned it was Ian MacKaye who approached Void about doing a split album with The Faith. At this point, the band was seasoned from playing shows and trying their hand at infusing heavy metal into their helter-skelter style of hardcore punk. That's not to say Void employed a sludgier sound by any means. Their style was still akin to a sprint on most songs. A lot of their material on the Faith Void Split feels like when someone is running so fast they stumble on the ground, but they manage to find their balance and keep running. In 1983, Void signed with Chicago's Touch and Go Records and recorded what I guess you could call their first official full-length. But according to a Vice interview with Stover, the band was moving in all sorts of different directions and couldn't find common ground. By the end of 1983, Void had broken up, which is not shocking if you're familiar with the history of punk music. Even then, they still had an album's worth of material ready to be released. They tried to put out the album on Touch and Go, titled Potion for Bad Dreams. But according to Ian MacKaye's liner notes on the 2011 compilation Sessions 81 through 83, Touch and Go founder Corey Rusk wasn't interested in putting out a record from a band that had already broken up, especially when they were in the process of signing a Texas band called Butthole Surfers to the biggest deal in the label's history at the time. And if you've been keeping up with this podcast according to Kurt's list, you know our Butthole Surfers episode is coming soon, so stay tuned for that one. To this day, Potion for Bad Dreams remains unreleased, but it was a smash in the bootleg market. Bands like the Melvins and White Zombie have claimed this lost album to be extremely influential to their own music. Void was a band that had very brief songs and an incredibly brief life as a band. And it's amazing that their influence has lived on to this day, over 4 decades since the band broke up and graduated high school. Most people, myself included, don't even want to remember the sort of things they did in high school, while the members of Void made music that has stood the test of time. It's a testament to the force of punk rock. Okay, that was both Dusty and myself, Martin Douglas, on Faith Void Split by The Faith and Void. Okay, let's get into it. When was the first time you heard this album?
I think the other day. I think it was the other day when I started working on this, to be honest. Which is cool. I mean, I think we've listened to so much hardcore that it kind of felt like it was building up to this moment.
Oh, absolutely. I had heard this album before, but it was, we've talked about this on the podcast where like I've only recently become a hardcore fan in like maybe the last like 3 or 4 years. So this is the first time as a hardcore fan listening to this album, which is, you know, one of the quintessential hardcore releases ever.
Yeah, totally. If you weren't a hardcore fan before this series, the past year has definitely like hammered it in our heads. Like, you will like hardcore. Kurt loved hardcore. But yeah, I'm glad we placed this here on the series because DC hardcore has come up a bunch of times. You know, Rites of Spring, Bad Brains. I mean, we've got a Black Flag of Henry Rollins and his, you know, heritage of DC. Dave Grohl played in Scream.
Yep.
Like, it's as much as, you know, it's the other Washington. As a kid, I always hated DC when it would come up on the news. I'd be like, that's the wrong Washington. I live in the real Washington.
It's funny because when I told people, when I lived in North Carolina and was moving out here, I told people I was moving to Washington, and most of them thought DC. And I'm like, no, Washington State. And then I realized that, oh, I have to tell people I'm moving to Washington State.
Right. I think that was a fun thing going through this record because, like, you know, DC punk and hardcore has such a reputation, like, appropriately. When you think of Minor Threat, Fugazi, Bad Brains, all these, like, quintessential bands. But then kind of finding out this is sort of like, if you know, you know, in the DC scene, this was kind of the tentpole release for a lot of people.
Oh, absolutely. And yeah, like, shout out to Minor Threat because for a long time, as I mentioned, when I wasn't a hardcore fan, Minor Threat was basically the only hardcore band I did like. So yeah, like, you know, so I have those, I have that fandom, that little tiny little fandom of DC hardcore. And yeah, like, I totally agree with what you're saying in the idea that for aficionados of the hardcore movement, the Faith Void split is one of the essential releases that, you know, has ever come out of that scene.
Aficionados and pachotos, maybe. Yeah, it's just such a cool, like, I don't know. It's been nice to, like, learn things. Yeah, it's been nice to learn things. Great insight. That's one of the greatest joys in the series is uncovering these little bits of history that I wasn't as privy to as I probably should be, and being okay with that, not being like embarrassed or anything. But I'm so excited to know about this and to know like the Mackay lineage with Alec Mackay as the singer of the Faith, and of course Ian Mackay of Minor Threat, Fugazi, Discord. I kind of equate with them as like punk rock Culkins.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
But yeah, it's just such a cool to see that lineage come through with each other, and both of these bands being so young and that youthful spirit transmuting through the music, and that being youth being a punk idea in itself.
I totally agree with that. And I think a lot about the straight edge movement in terms of DC hardcore and how that ties in with youth. And I think that is really cool that a lot of these bands were straight edge, and that movement came from this idea of rebelling against the excesses of their elders, which, you know, this album in particular comes at the beginning of the 80s, which is like the peak period of excess in my lifetime. I mean, you know, we all know you weren't born in the 80s. So but yeah, like we talk a lot about youth movements and how the youth movements of the past are gone because of consumerism and capitalism, and how, you know, this reflects a bygone time where youth culture was counterculture and actually really radical, and like radical in a way that, you know, didn't involve complaining on social media, which, you know, we won't get into all that.
But yeah, no, you make such great points. And like, I think it was, you know, in a lot of scenes, it was hard to be a part of it if you were young. And we think about that with Seattle, right? The teen dance ordinance in like the 90s. There's a great podcast, Jonathan Zwickel's podcast about that, if you look that up.
Shout out to Zwick.
Shout out to Zwick.
Supplementary shout out to our friends at KUOW.
Yeah. But yeah, it as much as like punk is for everybody, it was very hard for young people to get into it. And like the straight edge movement really helped push that. And I can't even remember, I've mentioned this before, decades later, being a young punk in my own scene, like feeling who didn't want to participate in, at the time, like drug culture or anything like that, made me feel like I could be a part of it. And of course, you don't have to do that to be a punk, but it's just cool to see different entryways for people to get into this type of music in these scenes and communities.
Yeah. And like a quick note on the whole idea of the teen dance ordinance is that inspired the youth movement of the Washington State punk scene.
Right.
So like I like how, maybe in the DC scene, the youth movement was kind of inspired by inspiration, whereas the Washington State youth punk movement was inspired by, we have nowhere to go.
Yeah. And shout out to our neighbors, the Vera Project, Fremont Abbey, all these all ages spaces we now have as a result of that movement here in Seattle.
Shout out to spaces from back in the day, like the old Firehouse Teen Center in Redmond, Washington, which, I have quite a few people near and dear to my heart who were teenagers that frequented that venue. So yeah, got to shout out the old Firehouse.
Yeah.
And thinking about like the idea that, all of these people were so young in this DC scene, it's so incredible to think about how Discord was founded by, Ian MacKaye, essentially, when he was so young. Like these are like people, barely out of their teens, maybe even still teenagers, like running this record label.
Yeah, there was a quote I found from Thurston Moore on the side A, talk about the faith and just him being so inspired by the youth and being kind of jealous of like, I didn't have this. I feel like I'm too old for this, but these kids are like incredible. And
right.
I still feel that all the time myself too. When I see like, if a bunch of kids could put together Discord records or Youth Riot records here or all these things that like, of course I can do it too. And it's cool to be inspired by people that are so much younger than you.
Right.
But it's all about accessibility, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And quick shout out to my Sonic Youth episode where I talk about how Thurston in particular, but pretty much all of the members of Sonic Youth were like a little too old for hardcore. And so like that's kind of what inspired their sound and things that they took from hardcore and all of that. But yeah, like I won't get into that too much. You can listen to the 90-minute Sonic Youth episode if you want to hear more about that. But also, I do want to talk about this notion of label identity because Discord had such a strong identity when they were, really putting out new records at a rapid clip. And it just reminds me of it's a sign of the times, basically, because, labels all throughout the 80s, going from Discord to Homestead to Touch and Go to late 80s Sub Pop. Yeah. Shout out to our friends at Sub Pop. They all had an identity. And I think that is also something that is somewhat being lost in the present day. Like there are still labels that have that sort of identity. I don't know why, but the first thing that came to my mind was the rap label Backwoods Studios. Shout out to Backwoods. Shout out to friends of the pod, Billy Woods, Elucid, Arm & Hammer. But yeah, like I honestly don't know where I'm going with this, but I wanted to speak on the fact that independent labels, especially in this era, had such a strong identity.
Yeah, I was talking to an Irish band once, and we were kind of making the comparison of representing indie labels being equivalent to like your football team that you represent. Like,
yeah, I love that.
yeah, and I was kind of like, yeah, it's how it kind of feels like when you're in the punk or indie scene, especially in America. I can't speak for them, but they said that really resonated, and I really feel that. Like I remember being a kid and Sub Pop being that for me, or K Records, where they have these. It just feels like you're part of something, and you look forward to the point of view that the label is putting forth, and the way they curate it. It's just so different than repping for like a corporation or something like that. Like there's a true spirit to it. Like I'm not out here like, oh, I can't wait for Sony Music's new release.
Can't wait for that new album on Interscope to drop.
Yeah, I'm such an Interscope head. But it's just this like sense of community that I like. And Discord, like, man, they're like the model for it. Yeah.
I mean, I just think a lot about that guiding ethos of those record labels. And it wasn't just an aesthetic thing. It was a cultural thing. And yeah, that's pretty amazing. I hope that we can get back to that. I know that I come across as a grouchy old head on this series, but the thing is, the old ways worked. And that's the point I'm trying to get across.
I agree.
This piece was produced by Dusty Henry. Audio was mixed by Matt Martin and Roddy Nikpour. Special thanks to Isabel Khalili and Larry Mizell Jr.
Just a reminder, we depend on your financial support to keep making these podcasts and everything we do at KEXP. If you want to be in the spirit of the Faith and Void, you could split and do 2 $5 donations if you like. A true punk rock split. Or become an amplifier, or make a one-time donation at kexp.org/Cobain. And even if you can't donate, we appreciate you listening. You're all part of the Cobain 50 community, and thank you for supporting us every step of the way. With that, I'm Dusty Henry.
And I'm Martin Douglas. We'll see you next week on the Cobain 50 from listener-powered KEXP, where the music matters.
Society.
Society is a whole.